Um, I have been doing some research on, the properties in Linden Street. I've always been interested in the history of my own property, and of course I've always been interested in history generally. And my talk tonight has gone through a lot of different configurations. I originally wanted to do a slide program, and I did take lots of pictures, but I waited too long to have my slides developed, not realizing that nowadays everybody has digital cameras and PowerPoint, and it's hard to get your slides developed. So my slides are still not developed, so I'm going to just do a talking program. And I'm going to concentrate mostly on the hows and the bonds, because what I found out was absolutely fascinating, and I have to admit it left me with a lot more questions than it did answers. And I always want to pay homage to my archaeological interest, so I wanted to find out what was going on in Berlin, at the time it was settled, who were the first people here, when were the first people here, all of that sort of information really intrigued me. So I did spend some time doing historical research into what was going on in the area, as well as research into the Howe and the Bonds families. And I'll talk a little bit about the first Howe who came to New England. He was John Howe, who was connected to Charles Howe, who was the Earl of Lancaster in Warwickshire, England, and who was connected with the court of King Charles I. So this Howe had connections. And he first lived in Watertown when he came over, which was about in the 1630s. And he was one of the first people to move into the Sudbury area. He had a proprietor's grant to Sudbury, and he very soon became a prominent citizen of Sudbury, involved in all the civic activities, and was a selectman for many years. And then he was one of the petitioners to move into Marlborough. So he was one of the very first settlers into Marlborough. And the Bonds family came over on the Speedwell much later. And from what I can determine, they were not as connected, to the nobility as the Howes were. But that doesn't really matter. Okay. And what I found out, and this really interested me a lot, is there were explorations in the Berlin area probably as early as 1632. Governor John Winthrop hires Thomas King to go out exploring for gold, silver, and iron. And this happened after the legislature passed a law that rewarded anybody who could find it. There was a real need for this, and the colonists, of course, wanted it. So I did find references to Thomas King tramping all over, the central Massachusetts landscape, Lancaster and Bolton and Sterling, and probably Berlin, too. There was, the people originally lived in Lancaster and Marlborough. Those were the first two towns. But before King Philip's War, they started to migrate out into, the wilderness. And it seems likely that there was somebody living right up there on the Berlin-Bolton line in Fryville. And there was somebody living, near the Berlin-Marlborough line. And there is somebody up by the Clamshell area. This is in the 1600s. After King Philip's War, they all go away, and they don't come back for quite a long time. King Philip's War devastated Lancaster. It was abandoned. It devastated Marlborough. It was also abandoned. There were only 3 houses left. And after the war, they started to come back into these towns, but they stayed clustered right around the garrisons. And in Marlborough, there are 27 garrisons that I could find. I don't know where all of them were, but it seems likely, that there were some that were fairly close to the Berlin town line. Down on the Bigelow Street area of Marlborough, that heads into Berlin, there seems to have been one. There was there were 27 garrisons. In Lancaster, there were 26 garrisons. One was in Fryville, that part of Bolton, right next to the Berlin town line. One was in Clinton, in the High Street, Water Street area. So they were around. And these garrisons had stockade fences around them. And in times of attack, they would all, you know, run to the garrisons for protection. Up until 1713, there were a lot of Indian attacks on the settlers in this whole area. Lancaster and Marlborough and Northborough. The accounts are just full of them, so the garrisons were an absolute necessity. After 1713, there was a treaty between the French and the English, and the attacks in this area stopped, so the garrisons were no longer necessary. And I do want to add that all of these attacks after King Philip's War were part of the ongoing wars between England and France for domination and empire of who would control North America. And this went on until 1763, but in Massachusetts they pretty much stopped after 1713. And what those wars did, it led the colonists to come to believe that they had to depend only upon themselves for protection. And that sort of sets the stage for the Revolutionary War, because they're no longer looking for protection from England against the English or the French. They realize that they've got to take care of themselves. So they begin to think of themselves as an occupied country, even though they're still British subjects. Okay, so after some of the stuff I found was absolutely fascinating. The first Howe in Marlborough is John. He has a son named Josiah, who also has a son named Josiah. And it's this Howe family that I'm going to track. Josiah has a son named Phineas, who was born in 1707. And this was interesting. I did a lot of genealogical work to find out just who he is and where he is from. And one of the records I found says that Josiah gets married in March 24th, 1732, but Phineas is born on March 17th, 1732. So I think there's a mistake there someplace. And a lot of times I found discrepancies between some of the records I was looking at and the Houghton record, so I don't know who's telling the truth. Anyway, so the legend goes, when Phineas Howe was 18, he was sent by his father into Boylston, which was then more unsettled, to found a house. And according to legend, he goes to Marlborough with an axe, his gun, his dog, and he blazes a trail on the trees as he goes along so that he can find his way to and from Marlborough. And, you know, according to legend, that there's hardly anybody living there. Well, I don't think that's true at all. Less than a mile away is a garrison house owned by Samuel Bennett. Phineas builds a log cabin, you know, on his land, and he lives there for the first year that he's there. And it says he lived there all by himself and, you know, took care of himself, so on and so forth. You know, I think he just went and stayed with the Bennetts all the time because they were just down the road in the garrison house. Phineas married Abigail Bennett, who was the daughter of Samuel Bennett. They had come from Lancaster. The oldest Samuel Bennett was killed in King Philip's War, so young Samuel knew what it was like to undergo Indian attack. He owned a sawmill, and he was a housewright, and he was a wonderful carpenter. Louise and I went to the house that Phineas built is still standing, and Louise and I went to see it. It's a gorgeous house. And part of the original house is still very intact. It's been modified, but part of it is still intact. So Phineas Howe obviously had some money. He built his house from 1726 to 1729. It's a gorgeous house. It's still standing. And his house at that time was in what was then Shrewsbury, but all of his land what was then Lancaster. And the first thing Phineas does is he starts buying all of the land around him. The land had been divided up amongst the proprietors of Lancaster, so there's no deed recordings for any of the original owners, but I did find a lot of deeds where Phineas buys land from each of the original proprietors. And I think Phineas went there because his father probably had a proprietary share in you know, what is now Boylston. That's how I think he gets there. Anyway, Phineas has a son also named Phineas, And it's this son who comes back to Berlin. But by then, Boylston is a much more settled town, and Berlin is a much less settled town. And I think there's something about the house that they like to go places where there aren't any people. Phineas Howe is the first person up on Barnes Hill Road that I can find. I have not been able to find the original deed, so I'm thinking that perhaps he was a proprietor and he may have gotten that land from the general court. I don't know. I'll have to do some more research in that area. He built the house that's still standing where the Wickstroms live today. And one of the first things I realized is the house in Boylston and the house in Berlin has a lot in common. There are some architectural features of both houses that are identical. You know, so we know that the same people worked on this house. Phineas owns a lot of land. He owned Rack Meadows. He owned 48 acres in Boylston. You know, the Howes are every place up there on Barnes Hill. You know, so I think it's just a fluke of history that it became Barnes Hill and not Howe Hill. And Phineas, one of the things that I found in looking through the deeds is there must be at least 100 land transactions, you know, deed transactions between Phineas Howe and everybody else. He's buying up a lot of land. The bonds come after. I think the Howes were there about 1750. That young Phineas Jr. probably did the same thing that his father. He went to Berlin when he was about 18, which would bring it just about to, you know, 1750. You know, but do you have any questions?
Well, I'm just reading that from the assessors. It says the Wickstrom's house was built in 1740. That's what the assessors say in there.
The assessors know those things aren't based on research at all.
Yeah,
Not when they're that old.
Yeah, I mean, if young Phineas came to Berlin when he was about 18, it would bring it up to 1750. And one of the things that I remember is when I was a child, my father had to fix, you know, the ceiling in our living room. It was in need of repair, and he kept postponing it and postponing it. And one day my mother got mad and just, you know, took the whole thing down. So he had to fix it. And on one of the beams up there, I remember distinctly, there was the initials SH, you know, 1750. And SH would have stood for Silas Howe, who learned the woodwright's craft from his grandfather, Samuel Bennett. And Silas was Phineas's brother. So and Silas is the one who took over the farm after Phineas left. So I think, you know, I'm not positive about that, but I think that's what happened. Anyway, so yeah, we did a lot. I want to share with you, you know, one of the problems that we had with deeds. Now this is a deed that is a land acquisition by Josiah Howe to from John Osborne to Josiah Howe, and Josiah is, you know, our Phineas's grandfather. And this one didn't make any sense at all to me, but I wanted to, you know, try to track down what's going on, what properties they own, and all of that. And the language of the deed, you know, begins with all that verbose language that the old deeds have. But then it goes on to say, a certain tract of land in Bolton near something that looks like Hog Swamp, and I wasn't aware that that Josiah Howe might have owned property there. But it goes on to say, and is bounded as follows, beginning at a white oak at the southeast corner and runs northeasterly 152 rods to a white oak tree, and then runs northwesterly 10 rods, then southwesterly 114 rods to a white oak, northwesterly 84 rods to a white oak, then northwesterly 30 rods to a white oak, then runs northerly 72 rods to a white oak, then runs easterly 36 rods to a white oak, then runs northeasterly 38 rods, then northwesterly 38 rods to a dead pine, then runs westerly to a white oak stump, then westerly 74 rods to a white oak, then runs southwesterly 42 rods to a white oak, then runs southeasterly 65 rods to a white oak, then runs westerly to 16 rods to a white oak. I mean, it just goes on like this for several more lines. And then finally 112 rods to where it all began. And by this time I was totally lost. I haven't a clue where this piece of property is. But I know that something is growing on it because, it says containing 110 acres, more or less, with something blank blank that I couldn't figure out lying or growing thereon. And I haven't a clue where this piece of land is. And the purchase price, by the way, was 650 pounds, which was a lot of money back then. So the deeds are just incredibly confusing. Anyway, and then Houghton in his history it sort of leads you to think that this conflict going on Barnes Hill. It says in the history that he gets rid of all the squatters and other itinerant people who were living there, but he doesn't tell us who it is or what they were doing or anything like that. Fortunatus Barnes is the first Barnes who comes to Barnes Hill, and he buys his land. He buys some land from Phineas Howe, but he also buys some land from a proprietor. And he builds a house. It's on the Feuerstein land. The back part of that house is the original house. And it seems to have been built sometime in the 1760s, because 1762 is the first deed that I could find of purchase of land from Phineas Howe. These people knew each other in Marlborough. The Barnes were garrisoned in the Howe, were stationed in the Howe garrisons. One of the Barnes sells his pew to a Howe who chooses to remain in Marlborough. They marry into each other's families, so they're related. And I have a suspicion that they were probably friends, otherwise they might not have built their houses so close to each other. And so Fortunatus has several sons. David is one of them. And David builds a house on what's now the present Rainville property sometime after 1790, probably 1794. I have not been able to find that deed. I haven't a clue where that deed is. And I was looking for it, and I found ever so many other deeds. One of the deeds that I thought was really interesting, when we were kids on our property growing up there was a cellar hole up on the hill. And Mr. Crackhout used to come up and, talk to my father, my parents about history. And of course, I was always all ears because I loved history ever since I was a child. So I knew that a Goodnow family lived up there. And when I was about 13 or so, I worked for the Schottners down there on the Berlin-Clinton town line. And old Mr. Schottner also had a lot of historical information. And he told me that in the 1920s they had moved a house that was up there and added it on to our house, which in my day was the kitchen and the shed that connected to the barn. Anyway, I found a deed for that where Phineas Howe buys 10 acres from the Goodnow land. Let me see if I can find it, because that one really interested me. There's one of the things also that was on our land, and I was always curious about this. In the Wickstroms, they have a gate, going into the driveway. There was also a gate at the other end of that road that led up a path going up to the Goodnow house. And in that deed, I found references when he's selling it to Phineas Howe that speaks about that road, this right-of-way. And he's not selling that right-of-way. He's keeping that up to that house there. But so it was on our land. So that, to me, was a question whether or not Ball Hill actually existed at that time. The section of Ball Hill that's there, I don't know. But what I do know is that road was the road that Daniel Goodnow, or William Goodnow, was used to get up to their house. And when we were doing tax research, and Barry was ever so helpful in helping me do all that tax research, I couldn't find that they ever paid taxes on that house or who ever did. You know, so I'm wondering, was this one of the squatters who had this little house that was up there on the hill, and he was driven off or bought off or whatever, and the house stood empty, or the house used it? I don't know. I don't know. So that's a question that I have. And there are ever so many other questions. The land across the street on Linden Street, that's now part of the Rainville Farm, was originally part of, you know, my farm. And I still think of it as my farm. And that was sold off to the Barneses at some point. And when William Barnes died, William Barnes lived in the Feuerstein house. He leaves that piece of land, or I think it's that piece of land, to David Barnes. And there's a road that he talks about going on that I can't figure out where it is. The Howes live in the Devines place. It's Major Ephraim Howe who lives there. There's another Howe who lives in the Pulsiver place for quite a long time. The Howes are all over that hill. They own almost the whole thing. About 1800, they got the urge to move on, and they moved up to Rumford, Maine, which is the northwest, you know, part of Maine in the mountain area. It's very fertile farmland, I understand, and they got proprietors' grants for land up there. So Phineas's 3 sons moved up there. Phineas himself later moved up there and died, and several of his daughters moved up there. So the Howes became very prominent up in Rumford, Maine. So I think they just had this adventuring spirit all the time.
It's very common name.
Yeah, it is. You know, so I'm going to do some research up there about the Howes, you know, to find out who, you know, why they moved up there. But our farm, you know, it stayed in the same family until about 1892 when Silas Greenleaf died. You know, and during all this time, they've intermarried into the Barnes family several times, not just once. So the families are quite connected. I also found a reference that Phineas Howe was 6'9". He was a giant, and his daughter was 6'2". You know, and in a day and age when the average man was barely 5'8", and the average woman was about 5 feet tall, they were giants. You know, and I also found another reference that one of his daughters, I think it was in Houghton, when Lafayette came to America, because she was so tall, she led the parade of, you know, the Lowell factory girls, you know, dressed in white, to greet, you know, General Lafayette. So I haven't finished my research by a long shot. I've got a long way to go to, you know, to try to figure out what was going on, you know, between the Howes and the Barnes. One of the things that I found in all the tax research is there's a real pattern in what's going on in farming. After every war, there seems to be a period of prosperity, and they do a lot of building. You know, after the War of 1812, there's a lot of building that goes on. After the Civil War, there's a lot of building that goes on again. You know, it seems to be a prosperous time for farmers. During World War I, they retrench, you know, so you know that times are hard. But during the 1920s, there's a real burgeoning of you know, farmland activity. You know, like the Rainville farm had 3 barns and 2 houses and an ice house and a carriage house and, you know, umpteen sheds. So you know, and a lot of animals. So you know that times are good. And, you know, my farm, our farm, you know, had a house, several barns, you know, an ice house. I wonder where the heck that could have been. You know, various sheds, lots of cows, lots of orchards. You know, so times are good for the farmers after the war. They're actually making money. But during the war, times are not so good. And, you know, that was really interesting to find out. And I was also interested to know, you know, that some of the Barnes, some of the Howes lived on the Devine property. They lived on the Pulsiver property. That was pretty interesting. The Nutting House was a Bonds house. That was built by Welcome Bonds. And that house is kind of interesting because John Goff of Hillside and Boylston lived there for a time. He married Mary Whitcomb, right, and lived there for a time before he built his great house in Boylston. So I guess I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions if I can. I've got a lot more research to do, and I want to keep on doing this because I actually found it to be quite fascinating, and I would like to really get a good, clear understanding of what's going on these two farmsteads, because that will tell us a whole lot about Berlin, what's going on in the town generally. So there are some pictures here for you to look at, and maybe the next time I'll have more information and I'll really have slides that I can show you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the Goodnow House, the site of the Goodnow House is about where Maplewood Farms are now, not where the barns are, but that's the property.
Yeah, they put their driveway right over it.
Right. They filled it in and put the driveway over it.
Yeah, right over it.
The cellar hole was there for years and years.
Yeah. And even when I was a child, I wanted to dig around it to see, what was there. And I can remember doing it, but I didn't know anything about archaeology when I was little. Yeah, does someone else have it?
Marianne, how big was the so the original house would have been that our old house, Wickstrom's?
Yeah.
That was how large was that tract of land?
Oh God!
How much acreage did it have?
He had at least 200 acres. He had a lot of land. I haven't quite figured it all out. He owned Rack Meadows, all of that land, he owned all of that land on that side. He owned 48 acres in Boylston. That was probably his wood lot, because when they had proprietors' records, you'd get good land, and then you'd get an allotment of not so good land. And the land in Boylston would have been the not-so-good land, their woodlot, whatever. He owned across the street, the fields that are now part of the Rainville farm. That was part of the farm. And they didn't own the piece that was Goodnow's, but they owned just about everything else up there.
Yeah. I thought the barns owned all behind us, hundreds of acres.
They did afterwards. Later.
Right, they bought it from the house.
the house.
Right. They bought it from the house. And then Bonds acquired a lot of other land, too, after that. But the original purchase was from the house. And it's the piece that you've got.
Again, there's that thing in the whole history about that there was some claim, the Barneses had some claim on some of that. Maybe there was a debt.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a loan or a debt on that.
There may have been a
that
loan.
Was involved in that deed when the Barneses came in.
Yeah. The first deed to the bonds doesn't indicate any kind of debt whatsoever. It's a it appears to be a strict
The 1760 deed.
right,
Yeah.
the 1762 deed. It seems to
Straight
simply
purchase.
be a purchase and sale. Of course, bonds had much more land than you could ever possibly use. And I'm thinking, but I'm not positive, that he probably got a proprietor's grant. One of the things about the house that I found out is several of them are connected, with the military, and they have high ranks. And I found quite a lot of records that, Captain Thomas Howe, for instance, Captain Ephraim Howe, petitioned the legislature, to pay, for money, to pay for their expenses, to pay them for particular deeds. And it was the custom, to provide some of these payments in land in lieu of cash. And that may be it, but I'm not positive about that.
Are there any descendants of these two families that survive in the area?
Yes, the person who gave the picture of Lucy Bonds is descended from the Bondses, and Oliver Carter was a descendant of Phineas Howe, and there may be some Carters around, but I don't know for sure. And I don't know if they know anything about their ancestry, because I don't think Lucy Holbrook knew anything about.
And I think Rusty Wheeler's family is descended from the,
Oh, the Barneses.
from the Barnes,
Yeah.
right.
Oh, and I have to tell you this because this intrigued me. Phineas Howe marries Abigail Bennett. In 1670, Mordecai MacLeod, who is in my children's, family tree, marries Lydia Bennett, so they're related. So my kids aren't really related to the Howes, but there's some kind of connection through marriage to them, and that kind of intrigued me. That was there.
Are those the Bennetts up there on Lyman Road?
I don't know. They could be, but I don't know.
You know where the Bennetts live?
On Lyman Road, yeah.
No, where the Bennetts lived that you were talking about, Samuel Bennett.
Oh, yes.
Where his garrison house was.
Yeah, his garrison house was right on Linden Street. It's about, the little pond, there's a little pond on the right before you get to Cross Street. It's right there. There's a slight hill. It's not really a hill. And if you look, there's a depression in the hill. And the marker has been moved up on top there, but you can see it from the road. It's back to the road, so you can't read it. But that's where the garrison was. And it's maybe half a mile to 3/4 of a mile from where the first Phineas built his house in Boylston. But that's where the garrison was on Linden Street. And Linden Street is an old Indian path, that became the county road very early in the 1700s. Now it was a stage line to Worcester. I found that out. And where they stopped, there was a stage station where Janet Golis lives now. There used to be a little red house that burned in the 70s, a very old house. That was the station, the stage station where they changed horses, was right there. And I did read, that when the stage went by, all the kids would run out to the road and bow to the stage. That was kind of cute. Yeah.
Talking about the garrison in Boylston by a pond, is that where the Shays Rebellion was?
I don't
Because
know.
there's a plaque there that says that it was the Shays Rebellion.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it was the Tories fighting.
Yeah, it was the Tories. Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure.
So, Marion, you're basically saying that during the Indian War, the population left.
Yes.
And after 1730, the town started to settle, or people came back in.
Yeah, people came back in. They clustered around the garrisons until, the Indian raids stopped.
So when Phineas Howe came and Fortunatus Barnes, they were one of the early people who came in the mid
Right.
18th century.
Right. Yeah, they're very early. Yeah, they're very early.
And prior to the 1713, prior to the Indian Wars, I guess it was basically Indians. And a
Right,
few-
they were Indians. And, and there is ample evidence of Indian occupation in that whole area. I found evidence, on our farm. I found something, I'd like to explore your place because, I think there is. I found evidence on the Divine property. There appears to be something, on the Pulsifer property. I haven't found anything on the Rainville property. That doesn't mean it's not there, it just means I haven't found it.
Well, we often forget that, that this whole area was populated well
Oh,
before
yeah.
the
Well
English
before.
came, and we really don't have much sense of what that population looked like or how they lived.
No.
It's like history started during the Revolutionary period.
Right, and that's
course,
just not the case. Oh, and one last, the monument stones, that a lot of the granite, that is from your place, the monument stones that stood at the front of our driveway, that all came from that piece of land. It was part of Phineas Howe's land where they want to put Jameson Ridge today. Now, there's a lot of evidence of 17th century quarrying up there.
Jameson Ridge, I mean, that's a fancy
Over
name
line
for
of
it,
oils.
Yeah, that development down the
for
road.
a development.
Yes, yes, yes. That's where the granite came from. There's still monument stones down there, but all the monument stones in the area came from that area. Right. And
You alluded to a couple of roads, Mary Ann. The one at the Wickstrom place, your father's old place there, that's a nice lane, goes right
Yes.
up the road.
Yeah.
Now, the other one from Louise's house
Right.
goes, that was a substantial road, quite a bit of fill across a wetland and a 4-foot wide stone walls, and it goes right up over,
So,
down in the Rack Meadow.
yeah, down to Rock
And
Meadow.
that must have been, Danny Tyler used to talk to me about how he hayed, when he was a boy, watch his father hay that Rack Meadow, and they'd pull the hay out, so that must have been the road that came up over there. And even when I was younger, that road, you could ski right down. It's all
Right.
grown up quite a bit now.
no,
but,
it's terrible now.
Yeah.
That's
you
quite
know,
that must have been the major road at that time.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking, that part of Ball Hill Road going up the hill may not have been there. Even though there's stone walls on it, I don't know. But I do know, the road that was on our farm is being used by the Goodnows, and they specifically speak of it in the purchase, of, from William Goodnow. They specifically speak of that road on our land, and I know there's one behind yours.
Right, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, so that part of, but yet, there were people who lived down the further, beyond that, down on Ball Hill Road. The Daffords lived down there. There were 2 or 3 families who lived down there.
There's a cellar hole up on that road.
Oh, yeah. We used to explore up there when we were kids. There were still lilac bushes growing by the cellar hole when we were kids.
Still are now?
When do you think the chestnuts were planted?
I think the chestnuts were native to the area and that they had been there for years, for eons. And I also think that explains why there's so much Indian activities, because chestnuts was one of their favorite foods. And they would have gone up there every single year, to gather the chestnuts. The chestnuts are almost the perfect food.
I found a slide of one of the chestnuts. I think they're all gone now, they've all fallen, right?
Yeah, there's some growing up. But Louise and I, several years ago, we took a walk up to Rack Meadows, and I was amazed at some of those great big old
Oh,
stumps.
the stumps were.
There's just lying on the ground still up there. Yeah, and there's talk that, the farmers used to take their cattle up there for grazing, then they used to hay it because it was high quality hay. So there's a lot of history we just don't know. But I'm finding, that the deeds are very helpful. The deeds, when I can figure out what they're trying to say, are very helpful. And the one I read to you is by far the worst example of any deed I ever saw. I haven't a clue where that piece of land is.
We just have to find the white oak tree.
Yeah, and
You
a
gotta
dead
find about
stump.
20 of them.
I know.
20 of them, dead stump.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions?